Hi, my name is Jennifer Lugris. My pronouns are she and ella. Please do not call me China. I am Korean. My family is from Uruguay and Korea and Spain. I identify as a mother, an artist, and a multicultural, multi-ethnic person. I speak English, Spanish. I used to speak some Catalan, but I think I've lost it. And I used to speak French too, but I think I might have lost that one along the way. This is what looking bilingual means to me.
Can you paint us the juxtaposition between Latinidad around you versus your Latinidad at home while you were growing up in North Bergen, New Jersey?
My dad is from Uruguay and my mother is Korean, but she was raised from being 12 to 19 in Argentina. And growing up, I was the only Uruguaya that I knew. So the people in my neighborhood were listening to a lot of salsa, eating arroz con frijoles. And this was something that I didn't have in my culture in Uruguay growing up. So en Uruguay mi padre escuchaba mucho rock and roll y siempre comíamos asado, que es diferentes tiras de carne con pan. Todas las cenas se comen con pan, que es muy distinto a la cultura donde yo crecí en North Bergen. La comida era distinta, la música era distinta, la cultura era distinta, entonces siempre me sentí como que no era realmente latina, ¿no? Porque yo era una latina muy distinta a los latinos que estaban en North Bergen, donde yo crecí.
Ojalá que te hubiera conocido en ese tiempo. And by the way, for those people that don't know, Jenny and I grew up in the same town. We ended up going to the same university and both ended up in Barcelona, but didn't know each other until we were in Barcelona, which is crazy. Ojalá I had known you growing up, because I would have loved to have been rock and rolling with your dad and eating asado and everything like that. That sounds amazing. So what were the cultural and linguistic experiences you had with your Korean cousins?
My mom is the oldest of her siblings. There's 4 siblings, and because she was the oldest, she was told, okay, you have to marry a Korean. Well, it turns out that she was the only one to fully adapt the Argentinian culture so much growing up in Argentina that she married my dad, who was from Uruguay. So when my grandmother met my dad, she chased him around with a pot and was like, I'm going to kill you, practically, and told my mom that she needed to choose between her family and her dad. Luckily, she made the right choice, because here I am.
So that's so sad, though. I mean, I understand the story and the context, but what a decision to have to make, right?
It was a real Romeo and Juliet story. And I think that it shaped me a lot as an artist when I chose to be an artist for the first time. My mom wasn't fully supportive of that decision. She was a bit worried, like, how was I going to make a living? Typical things that parents worry about. But I decided to go for it anyway. And I think growing up hearing that story, it's always been important to me to follow your heart, follow your goals, because that's what my mother did. And luckily, she's still happily married. And had she had listened to her parents and not made the decision that she made, I don't think she would be living such a fulfilling life that she's living. So I grew up with my dad speaking Spanish and my mom speaking Spanish at home. So I grew up bilingual with English and Spanish. But my cousins, they grew up learning Korean because their parents, even though they spoke Spanish, like their mother and their father spoke Spanish, they married a Korean. So they grew up learning Korean, whereas I never learned Korean.
Right. And so eventually, I take it that your mom did get back into the good graces and they got back into her good graces, enough for you to have met your cousins and to have had that relationship with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would be really difficult for a parent to fully abandon their child. So I grew up with my cousins. I grew up watching them. I mean, I just remember going to their house all the time as a little kid and having to do like the saludos, like in Korean, like 안녕하세요, and feeling so embarrassed because I didn't really speak the language. And when you're a kid, you don't want to be put on the spot, but they're kind of putting you on the spot saying like, you have to bow in Korean to say hello and goodbye. And I just remember thinking, this is so awkward. I feel so awkward because this isn't my language. What's really interesting is watching my mother interact at the dinner table with her siblings, because the conversation is just like seamlessly shifting from Korean to Spanish to English, and it keeps going in this circle. circle. So parts of it I'm understanding, and then parts of it my cousins are understanding. And little by little, we're all getting together, piecing together the conversation and what they're talking about.
I would love to see that. That's amazing.
Interesting experience to be Korean and speak Spanish, because no, that's kind of the unexpected. People don't expect someone that looks a certain way to speak a certain language. So when Spanish starts coming out of their mouth, they're always surprised. Like folks are like, "Whoa, this person speaks Spanish."
Yes, yes. And I've seen that happen. I've seen it happen with even folks from other countries. There's a huge Cuban Chinese population. There's a huge Peruvian Japanese population. And whenever people say, wait, what? And I'm like, yes, yes, you should. It's a really fascinating story of how folks ended up in these other countries. And Latinos really are everything. So can you share with us how motherhood and performance art helped you learn your Korean grandmother's name?
Sure. So when I first became a mother, I felt a growing importance to know my family history, because I wanted to be able to share that with my daughter. En Korean culture nunca usamos los nombres de las personas, siempre tenemos un título. Por ejemplo, a mí nunca me llamaban Jennifer, siempre me decían Oñi. Oñi quiere decir hermana más grande, es de respeto, se llaman así. Entonces mi abuela siempre se llamaba Halmoni, que quiere decir abuela, y mi abuelo Haraboji. Entonces yo tenía 32 años cuando nació mi hija, y estaba pensando, yo no sé el nombre de mi abuela. ¿Cómo puede ser, no? Porque los americanos siempre es grandmother esto, y en español es siempre abuela Flor, ¿no? Mi otra abuela se llama abuela Flor. Pero Harmony era Harmony, no tenía nombre, ¿no? Bueno, claro que tiene nombre, pero yo no lo conocía. Entonces, cuando nació mi hija también no tuve tanto tiempo para pintar, porque o era pasar el tiempo con mi hija o era pintar, no podía hacer los dos, ¿no? Y yo prefería estar con mi hija, porque era un bebé y quería pasar mucho tiempo con ella. Entonces empecé a hacer un arte tipo performance art para aprender el nombre de mi abuela. Entonces le pedí a mi mamá, por favor, escribí el nombre de mi abuela. Entonces ella escribió Shin Tong-so, y lo escribió en coreano, que es un idioma que yo estudié en la universidad y sabía el alfabeto, pero no sabía cómo, no sé cómo hablarlo ni nada, pero I know the letters, so it was enough to be able to write it. So
Sí,
I
sí.
spent every free moment that I had, I spent writing her name in Korean and thinking about her and thinking like, who was this woman that I had never met, that everybody had told me stories about. So kind of meditating on her, and that's how I memorized her name. And I still don't know my grandfather's name, but I guess that will be the next art piece that
I was gonna say. And when you say performance art, did you record any of this act like with a camera, or do you have maybe the different copies? Like, I guess, how do you keep it? How do you archive that?
I have the original papers that I wrote on. So,
Oh, nice.
yeah, so this was like every time I could steal 5-15 minutes, I would be writing her name, trying to memorize it and thinking about who she was.
I appreciate that story so much, and what a beautiful and brilliant idea, and what a way to connect your culture, language, and discovery. And that's just a meditative practice of, in a way, self-discovery, but also family and ancestral discovery. I think that's so beautiful. And I think there's so many interesting ways that people can probably use that as inspiration to go and do it the way that they would do it, to potentially learn a language deeper if they don't know it fluently enough for their taste, or learn more about their families. So I think you've got something here. Actually, I think that's something that you can definitely. It sounds like, I don't want to say art therapy, but it sounds like a very useful tool for people who want to learn more about their families.
Yeah, and to me, it's an interesting fact about growing up Korean, especially when you're growing up Korean in the United States, where with married to an American man who thinks it's outrageous that I never knew my grandmother's name until I was in my early 30s.
Right? Isn't it
just
funny?
natural.
Yeah. And it's fascinating that you were big sister. You weren't cousin. You were big sister
Mhm.
to your cousins. I love that. Y bueno, esto ya lo has dicho un poquitín, pero ¿cómo tu multiculturalismo ha influido tu arte?
Bueno, yo soy pintora, entonces a mí me encanta pintar, y cuando recently, cuando estaba haciendo cuadros, I started working in different panels. So, not just making a painting on one canvas, but using many different canvases to make one painting, which usually is called a diptych if it's two paintings, and a triptych if it's three paintings. But unlike the traditional way of using diptychs and triptychs, where it's very easy to see how one leads into another, I deliberately made it so that the audience had to work to find the connections to pull it all together. And this was a reflection of growing up when I would tell people, "Oh, I'm Uruguayan and I'm Korean." And folks would always give me this funny look like, "Wait a minute, you're Hawaiian?" No, Uruguayan. It's a small country in South America, and Korean. Oh, wow. How did that mix come to be? Oh, that's so interesting. So kind of that quizzical look that I would get growing up, I wanted to recreate that experience in the paintings. I also have areas in my paintings where there's realism mixed with abstraction, where there's very textured areas mixed with flat areas. And this is because I'm talking towards the unexpected. So just like, it's unexpected that my Korean mother speaks Spanish. It's unexpected that I didn't know my grandmother's name until very recently. Like all these unexpected stories that come up because of the richness of the culture that I grew up in, that seems so matter of fact to me, but it's unexpected to the audience. I wanted to include that in my painting process.
That's such a stunning way to use your history in your art. And I think it's so inspirational to have that story behind it and to see how it affects your audience and how they receive it. Do you have situations in which people talk to you about what they see or share with you their experience of your art?
Well, I think all of us, most of us, at least in the US, come from mixed backgrounds. So even though mine might be a little bit extreme coming from two different parts of the world, everyone in the US, if you dig deep into your family history, comes from this beautiful, rich background, or at least most people do. So, really, although the work is personal, it's meant to reflect the audience. It's meant for people to look at it and say, "Hey, I see myself in that work. That's also my story too." And in that way, I'm kind of sharing on the all of our experiences as multi-ethnic, multicultural people. They say like the US is like a melting pot. That's what makes our country so beautiful, is that we have so many different cultures coming together and then adapting some of the American culture along the way.
Is how we had such a great conversation about celebrating and experiencing joy as multicultural, multi-ethnic people while recognizing our family history and the hurdles our ancestors faced. Could you take us home with your words of wisdom?
There's this movement now, within the artist community, within people of color, to dismantle dominant narratives and now insert more of a celebratory or joyous way of looking at our histories. So, growing up, I heard a lot of stories about racial discrimination, discrimination against immigrants, stories that were very negative and never spoke to the hurdles that our ancestors and us too have overcome. And although it's very important to share these stories because they are factual, in my opinion, what they lead to is a cycle of helplessness, because you feel they're not empowering. They don't make you feel good about where you come from. They make you feel as if you're going to overcome a lot of walls, which you probably are, right? But now I think it's really important. And what I try to bring in my artwork is telling stories of how those walls have been overcome, talking about our family history from a place of joy, from a place of celebration, where you're sharing gratitude for every opportunity that you have now because of the sacrifices that your ancestors and your family members have made. So, for example, my grandmother, the one whose name I recently memorized, came from North Korea, and she walked during the Korean War, nearly dying of starvation, to get to South Korea to escape what was happening in the North. And then she moved to Argentina, where she encountered a military dictatorship that was responsible for the disappearance of thousands of people. ended up moving to the US to protect her family. My dad also left that same dictatorship in Uruguay and came to the US to, live a better life. And all of these things need to be celebrated. So, my work, what I do is I paint everyday mundane circumstances as extraordinary. I use super bright colors, patterns, textures to highlight that every single thing in my life is a gift that I was given because of the people that came before me and because of the sacrifices that they were willing to make for me to have the opportunity that I have to live the life that I live and to give the life that I can give to my children. And in a way, I see a lot of other Latinos or Latine, which I prefer to use, also adapting this in their artwork as well. Where, I saw this amazing performance by Contratiempo, which is a theater group, and they were saying like joy as the ultimate form of resistance, because it is a form of resistance to talk about these stories, to dismantle the dominant narrative and instead insert one from joy, insert one from being grateful, insert one from celebrating who we are, rather than only focusing on the hurdles, looking at them as things that we have now overcome, to get the opportunities that we now have in life.